Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Singularity Let's Play. You folks are well, taking care of each other and being kind to yourselves. We're doing the music exploration. Use headphones for best experience. Right. I have headphones on, but the experience is not much. Maybe it's because I turned the volume so far down. I don't know. It's not off though. Right? Yeah, it's so far down you can't even hear it. Right. Trying to get color of a note here. So anyways, I hope you folks are well. I know it's been a little bit since last video in this series. Lately I've been doing a lot of videos for my Stars Let's Play. I mean, eventually I'm going to get burnt out on that, and I'm trying to build up a massive buffer. Kind of future winning stuff a little more, so that videos in that series coming out as far out as March already. It's July now. Spread them kind of far apart. The idea is people are subscribed will be guided towards whatever's coming out, and I have some other series that are still in their buffer now. To avoid clumping stuff up too much in case, because my housing situation has become somewhat unreliable. I mean, I want to marry B, but you never know. Like, if you need to be able to renew that for long, it's expensive. Despite claims, oh, it's affordable. Not really. There's lots of actual apartments that are much cheaper. Perhaps it's cheap for a house that's been used this way, but there's a reason actual apartment buildings exist, and that's because they are an efficient way to house lots of people who don't have a ton of money. And you can always do luxury apartments and condos for a denser, nicer standard of living, which is something that's actually goes up in a lot of places, and people complain about gentrification. I mean, too many people can't afford housing, but the real problem is inequality of income, so that people at the bottom don't have the purchasing power to buy nicer housing units. Stuff like housing assistance programs being underfunded and only being able to afford to put people in the cheapest housing, and having insanely long waiting lists, which, I mean, a lot of people on those programs are disabled or escaping from abusive situations. In my case, on the waiting list for those things, and I'm both. Not the worst abusive situation, and verbal and emotional. You have to, like, some of the things you check the box for abuse and automatically tries to say, like, it assumes you mean like physical. It's like, no. But just because someone isn't hitting you doesn't mean not abusive. Someone can yell at you and toy with your emotions and control you and do lots of things that are not okay without actually laying a finger on you. And indeed, that sort of abuse is more common when it's men being abused. It's because we have the stereotype of, you know, men beating family members, and I mean, that happens, but there's absolutely other types of abuse. As I said, those are ones that are more likely to be more egalitarian, so to speak, because anybody can raise their voice, anybody can use whatever control they have, such as financial. I was staying with a family member who, because I'm disabled long COVID, had an inordinate amount of control over my ability to survive. You know, it's not like I could live out my own, and indeed my savings will eventually run out if I can't monetize this YouTube channel and can't get housing assistance soon enough. SSI people, if they drag their feet or try and make bullshit excuses, throw paperwork at me to block me getting SSI soon enough. And if they do, it's not even enough to pay rent in most areas. I'd have to be hard to even find something to afford on it. I got screwed up SSDI by a rule that was at changes to the law that were made in the mid-90s that excluded certain jobs from paying payroll tax. Most notably jobs while you're a student at a university more than half time. And since I spent a lot of time in graduate school, and while I was in graduate school, I was working for the university. Actual real employment I did not pay into payroll tax and count towards disability work credits even though I was working. It's bullshit. And because it's an all or nothing, you have to get a certain number of work credits, you're screwed. And the system, it doesn't even like ramp up gradually over life. The number of work credits you need ramps up to your like 30, 31, and that just plateaus to the 40s. So that plus screwing over people who worked for university is almost express designed to screw over young people who get disabled and spent time in grad school. I mean, I couldn't think of a better way to screw over that population of people, especially since it's not just universities, it's working for universities, working for religious organizations, working for certain classes of nonprofits. So, you get some idealistic young person, they go to grad school, they work while they're in university for the school. They're, over half time, of course. Then they graduate, then they go and work for a nonprofit. Still not counting. Maybe they do work for a religious nonprofit somewhere along the way too. It doesn't matter if it's religious or not. And that person hasn't been earning any work credits, even though they've been working potentially for, maybe they get disabled at like, I don't know, 34, which is older than I got disabled. They may have worked for 10 years and not have a single work credit. Because the system is designed to screw people. It's designed to be full of holes. It only exists as a excuse that people in power can say, look, there's systems to help people. We don't need more, except the systems are intentionally designed so you can't actually benefit from them when you need them. It's a farce. And it's a farce so that America's abusive ruling class, because it is an abusive relationship America has with its ruling class, and America really needs to break up with its ruling class to kick these pricks out of power, which is ironically what drove like some people to vote for Trump and such, is because they thought that would be doing that. But no, Trump has only brought in more of the sort of, it's partly because people don't even understand who really does rule them. It's not the politicians. They're actually, politicians are pansies for the people who really hold power, and that's the billionaires and the 100 millionaires. People with like more than $100 million are the people who hold most of the power in the United States. And they're the ones who make the real decisions. They buy politicians, both through campaign donations, which people always talk about, and actual bribery, which people never talk about because it's never the form of just handing someone a check. That would be too obvious and we get someone arrested. Instead, what they do is technically perfectly legal, is they sign book deals with politicians. Politicians write these shitty books. I read a couple of them. They're never well written. I read the one that Al Gore and Obama wrote both. They were both not very well written books. But billionaires fund think tanks. The think tanks will buy like 100,000 copies of one of these books at $20 a book, or 10,000 copies or whatever. And that's money through the, publisher gives a percent to the politician, and that's money directly into the politician's pocket. In fact, some of these books sell almost no copies except to these think tanks. I mean, don't try and push them, since these books are often statements of ideology and propaganda. So they'll try and push them in certain places. I think they might sell a few copies because there's still money but they're books that would not be profitable at all if not for these think tanks buying tens of thousands of copies. It's outright bribery funneled through a think tank. And then insider trading on top of that, where, politicians get tips on, moves about businesses about to make ahead of time so they can benefit from it. This is technically illegal, but very hard to catch. So it's a mix of legal and illegal forms of what boil down to bribery. So the politicians become millionaires, and the campaigns are funded by the billionaires on top of that. And yeah, they are paid to do the will of the very, very rich. were the real ruling class. And so voting for Trump didn't change anything about that, because Trump is very much in bed with those billionaire types. He's a billionaire himself, supposedly. He's not deeply in debt, but he has billions in assets, though he may have more debt than he has assets. But he has a lot of money in the bank, but also a lot of debt, so it's hard. It gets complicated. A lot of these billionaire types do. But when they buy politicians, they usually get more benefit than what it costs them. So that if they're trying to keep their head afloat and they're financially troubled, they actually increase their political donations. They don't decrease them. Because if they bet well on the politicians, they can have it pay out very handsomely. And even if a particular politician tends that to be a bad bet, chances are that it pays off so handsomely when it does work that it's on average. It's not like gambling where you lose on average. It's something where on average they're going to win big time. The only way we can do anything, the only way America can have a breakup with this ruling class is, at this point, with the new Constitutional Convention. We need to rewrite the Constitution to ban money in politics, to make things like Citizens United impossible. The Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, that can only be fixed with constitutional amendment, but there's a lot of things that need to change. America needs to uncap the size of the House of Representatives and move to a proportional representation system there, and the reason for that is that would allow third parties to actually get House seats that are smaller and never are going to get more than half the votes in a district, but might, get 30% of the votes in a state. And if the state has 10 seats proportional representation, that would still be 3 seats. Or even if it's got 5 seats, that would still be a seat, which would allow third parties to actually start to grow, actually have real power, because they would have actual House votes, and a ranked choice voting system for the president and senators, so that they don't have to spoilers, so third parties can get House seats and run candidates for the Senate and presidency, which at first they won't win, but they'll be able to make it to the debates, which it cannot be understated how important it is to be able to make it to presidential debates and Senate debates. And be able to make points publicly. So, you get the Green Party, you get the Libertarian Party. These parties can actually go there, and, better parties that haven't formed yet, which might form when people see that they can actually form parties aside from the Democrats and Republicans. In the long run. So these kind of change to the way voting works, and these are big changes. These are substantial changes to the structure of government. What we have is not a perfect system handed down by God. It's something that was created by a bunch of wealthy slave owner assholes who lived on plantations, a lot of them. The founding fathers were no saints. Now, I'm not going to go with they were terrible people. In some ways, they were ahead of their time. But it's absolutely time to move past the government structure they hand to us. It hasn't been perfect. It's shown its flaws. It's been co-opted. Originally, the size of the House of Representatives was not capped, so it grew with the country's population. That was the system our founding fathers handed to us. So even by that standard, we shouldn't have capped the House. That was done in the 1920s as a blatant act of political sabotage by I believe it was the Republican Party at the time, or it could have been the Democrats. I don't remember. The parties have changed. At the time, I think it was Republicans who acted like the Democrats do today. So it was actually, but anyways, it had to do with shifting population patterns, and one of the parties, it doesn't really matter which, was afraid to lose power by population shifting into the cities. At the time, the Republicans had a lot of rural progressive support. Rural populations didn't become so conservative, at least not in parts of the Midwest, until later, with racism being the big issue that drove that. But when it came to economic issues, you had some very progressive people out in the Midwest and such. But anyways, shifting population patterns into the cities, increasing control of the billionaire class, things like this, it all played into capping the size of the House, which, by the way, amplified the effects of billionaires. Because you have fewer House members, it's easier for the politicians to buy each one off in terms of we're talking the personal bribery, the book deals kind of stuff. Because I mean that's more refined than what used to occur back then, where sometimes it was literally like just checks. Back in like the early turn of the century, outright bribery was more common. Now the book deals and more clever stuff like that happens. But politicians have been bought by billionaires for a long time in the United States, and there was a tension around like 1920 when the House was capped. There was the progressive movement had been gaining a lot of ground, and there was a real chance that the billionaire power would be broken. This was after the Gilded Age, which was until that point the high point in income inequality and wealth and power inequality in the country. We've actually surpassed the Gilded Age now, where it's never been as bad as it is now, ever before in American history. Even when America was a slave-owning country, there wasn't this much income inequality, which is insane if you think about it. Of course, that was partly because you had a lot of small free states, small farmers and free states in the North. The South was deeply unequal, and if you look at just the South and consider it like a country, it probably was worse than today. But the North was a lot more equal than it is now. The free states were much more egalitarian. And, anyways, whereas you look now, like you see states like Massachusetts and New York have very high levels of income inequality. Blue states, actually. But this is part of why the welfare systems are strong in these states, is a lashback against the immense inequality in these states, is to try and at least stop a lot of the working poor. There's still a lot of discrimination against like the actual disabled and such. But to try and stop the working poor, and to some degree there's been some empathy for like single mothers and such, but not, say, young men who become disabled, which is my situation. To try and stop them from suffering so badly in states that are deeply, deeply unequal. It's not because these states are super egalitarian, there's left-wing politics. It's because they're so unequal that's driven left-wing politics. People deeply misunderstand a lot of the states in New England and New York. People outside of them anyways, and a lot of people in them have these illusions that they live in some kind of egalitarian utopia. It is technically a liberal utopia, but not in the sense of liberal as people understand the term in America. Liberal in the sense of neoliberalism, of businesses being free to do a great deal to the population, but with some anti-racism, which is technically part of neoliberal theory, but rarely gets emphasized. Neoliberals very often cooperate with racism, so it gets complicated. Ronald Reagan was neoliberal, but so was Bill Clinton. So, this goes into, how American politics are so far right compared to the rest of the world. These were very different politicians, but very different within the spectrum of America. Not within the spectrum of global politics, where they were both pretty far to the right. This is something people fail to realize, how incredibly messed up the US is. Why is it so messed up? Part of it is the legacy of the Cold War. Part of the legacy of demonizing anything left-wing, of saying Marxists are evil and such, and, well, there were real problems with the Soviet Union, no question. Although they didn't sponsor genocide after genocide after genocide after genocide like the United States did. In fact, in the past 60 years, because it really started in the early 1970s. Before then, the U.S. hadn't really done this, but starting, I think, 1971, 72, the U.S. started sponsoring genocide after genocide after genocide in its puppet regimes, starting with the Bangladeshi genocide, the Indonesian genocide, the East Timor genocide, and then progressing to the first Congolese genocide. We're now in the second Congolese genocide, which I don't like Trump, but occasionally there's a silver lining to him, and one of those is that he's actually tried to stop that. Not because I think he gives a damn about the victims of it, but because I think Trump realizes the U.S. is spread too thin and is supporting too many genocides, and it's destroying the country's credibility. So he actually tried to do a peace deal in the Congo. Who knows if that peace deal will hold? It's not actually the U.S. that's directly sponsoring that one. It's the British, who are a U.S. ally, and so the U.S. aids the British in sponsoring the genocide by way of Rwanda, which is the country that's actually directly doing it. So that's kind of removed. The first Congolese genocide had more direct U.S. involvement. First of the 20th century, there was also the 1800s one that Belgium did. Congo's had like 3 or 4 genocides. It's insane. A country has gone so messed up by Western imperialism. Let's see. East Timor, Indonesian, Bangladeshi. Technically, I don't usually count this, but technically the leading English language expert on the Korean War says that the U.S. bombing North Korea flat was a genocide. And by the way, not one provoked by the North Koreans. People have swallowed the Kool-Aid. They bought the propaganda on that war, the Korean War. It's also been largely forgotten. It's sometimes called the Forgotten War. It was actually, if you're considering who started a war, there's a few ways to look at it. One is who fired the first shot, and the answer to that is not the North Koreans. The South Koreans fired the first shot of the Korean War. And in fact, quite a few shots. They were conducting these cross-border raids into North Korea, and after like the 11th or 12th time that South Korean troops crossed the border into North Korea and blew stuff up and killed people, the North Koreans considered that a cause for declaring war. Now, did they want to reunify the Korean Peninsula? Yes. Did they have a right to? Also yes, actually, because South Korea was a direct perpetuation of the Japanese puppet state that had existed, because the Japanese conquered the Korean Peninsula in the 1920s. Terrible time. People think of it as great because the Roaring Twenties or flappers or something. It's a very America-centric view of what was going on in that time in the world. That's blind to the horrible things that were happening. You had the beginnings of actually Nazism, even though the Nazi Party hadn't formed yet, in Germany in the 1920s, with actually the Social Democratic Party, a supposedly left-wing party, employing the pre-Nazis. A lot of the people they employed actually became leaders of the Nazi Party that's formed, to murder leftists, to murder Marxists and anarchists and democratic socialists, like actual people who actually wanted to abolish capitalism, who were affiliated with the Spartacist League originally, and like even after the Spartacist rebellion ended, people who had been affiliated with it were hunted down and murdered by far-right death squads that were employed by this left-wing party, the Social Democrats. So you had the beginnings of Nazism, because a lot of like the people in these death squads would later become leading Nazis, or not leading, but they become lieutenants, captains, colonels in the Nazi army. You had the beginnings of Nazism. You had Hungary sliding fascist after World War I. You had at that time Romania had not yet started to slide fascist, though eventually would, and join the Axis powers. Hungary, Germany, Italy. Mussolini actually took over Italy well before Hitler took over Germany. So you had Italy starting to do his thing. Mussolini starting to do his thing in Italy. And I think, Hitler did his beer hall push. Was that in the 20s? I don't think so. I think that was actually in the 30s. No? Late 20s? The exact timeline, I should know it, but I don't have it memorized. So yeah, you had the Japanese invading, conquering the Korean Peninsula, taking Manchuria from China, like just stealing a broad area of northeastern China, what's People's Republic of China today, just conquering it. Completely unjustified, done on the basis of it being a, quote, lawless region, so they marched in and annexed it, basically, and set up a puppet government there. And claimed they were bringing civilization. It was ridiculous. It was outright imperialism by the Japanese, mixed with a lot of mass murder to subjugate the civilian population, which was pretty thin in the area, so not that many people had to actually die for that to happen, but it was still horrible, just because you only murder a few people because it's a rural area without that many people to begin with doesn't make it any less evil. Yeah, Japan did horrible things then. And, Japanese fascist collaborators had come to rule who were many Koreans who worked with this horrible Japanese fascist government before World War II, had come to rule the Korean Peninsula before World War II, during World War II. And then at the end of it, because the United States nuked 2 cities in Japan, which were, by the way, selected to maximize civilian casualties, not for any military value. And indeed, it was even suggested nuking a naval base or dropping atomic bombs off the coast to scare the Japanese. It absolutely wasn't necessary to nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the US did. In fact, it's the only country that ever nuke a city, ever. So, because Truman did that evil shit, and Truman was a terrible person who betrayed FDR's legacy in a lot of ways, and was not the choice of FDR as his successor, really. I mean, FDR kind of gave this wishy-washy statement about who to be his vice president, but his vice president from 4044, Henry Agrid Wallace, not to be mistaken for the racist, fascist George Wallace, entirely different person, despite the same last name. Henry Agrid Wallace, a progressive, someone who wanted to end segregation in the South in the 1930s and 40s in the U.S. He started advocating that in the late 30s. Smart, progressive guy, had been FDR's Secretary of Agriculture before 1940, became his vice president from 1940, was in that position until 44. He was the one that the vast majority of Americans, and especially Democrats, wanted as the next vice president in 44. But Democratic Party bosses rigged the 44 convention, and there wasn't that much of a fuss because the business elites who controlled the newspapers were very much in approval of this, because Truman was much further to the right than Wallace was. Henry Agrid Wallace, again, to be clear which Wallace we're talking about. And so the newspapers were mum about it. A lot of ordinary Americans were overseas. This was, around the time the D-Day invasions are occurring. U.S. troops are fighting their way up through Italy, liberating the, countryside. It absolutely was not a time where America's focus was on the Democratic convention. So the Democratic Party bosses were able to get away with rigging it. There were some protests and some outcry and some editorials and such against it, but not nearly enough. And they got away with it. And they basically stole the presidency, the Democratic Party bosses, because they put someone who was not the choice of Democratic or Republican voters. More than half of Republicans wanted Wallace, and something like 70-something% of Democrats from polling at the time. So he's the clear choice, kind of like how Bernie Sanders actually had surprisingly strong approval among Republicans. But Clinton ended up being the Democratic nominee for president, in 2016. But Truman was forced on a rigged convention on the country. Democratic Party bosses knew FDR was going to die in office. They wouldn't live to 48, so they knew they were essentially backdooring in their much more conservative guy, into the presidency. And then, Truman did horrendous things like nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ordering all sorts of cities to be firebombed, which is a war crime. And starting the Cold War. Truman was very much responsible for that. I mean, FDR thought, he had an understanding with the Soviets, and Wallace believed that the Soviets could be worked with and friendship could pervade after World War II. Truman intentionally put out his Truman doctrine of we must continue communism or it's going to domino affect the world, which absolutely did not happen. The US lost the Vietnam War. Vietnam went communist. It's not like all of Southeast Asia flipped communist. That didn't happen. It was absolute nonsense and excuse for a million, obviously not, that's exaggeration, but for a whole bunch of wars that should not have happened. And for a whole, I mean, we're not even just talking like Korea and Vietnam. We're talking sometimes these little undeclared wars where, Marines invade a country and it barely makes the history books. Coups, assassinations, invasions. This was all, I mean, Truman was an imperialist. He was in bed with the billionaires, and the billionaires wanted to invade countries to set up puppet governments that were more favorable to U.S. business interests. And one of these governments was the Pakistani government that committed the Bangladeshi genocide, because Bangladesh had been part of Pakistan, tried to declare independence, and that's what led to the Pakistani government committing the Bangladeshi genocide. Another one of these was the Indonesian government, another U.S. puppet regime that supported billionaire interests, business interests, and was, of course, backed by the State Department, giving them massive foreign aid, and CIA assassinating people who were standing against the Indonesian regime. And in fact, the coup that put the Indonesian government in power was organized partly by the CIA. I mean, well, CIA support. It wasn't entirely the CIA's idea, but they helped it along. And this puppet government, which, by the way, replaced a left-wing elected legitimate government. This is a repeating pattern. A country elects a left-wing government. The U.S. does a coup, puts in a far-right government that's unelected, that uses military terror and death squads to maintain its power. That government did two genocides, the Indonesian genocide and the East Timor genocide. East Timor was a separate country from Indonesia. Indonesia invaded, annexed. Indonesia still tries to claim it's part of the country even today. They invaded the country, annexed it, and then genocided most of the native population of this very small country. So, they killed a large percentage, more than half of the people who live there. Very, very small number of people live there, so the death toll isn't that high. But again, just because the area doesn't have a lot of people doesn't make killing off a large percent any less evil. So yeah, 3 genocides all supported by the U.S., all in the 1970s. And, the first Congolese genocide, I think that was started in the 80s. That was more on Reagan, anyways, than Nixon. Nixon and Kissinger were behind those 3, although, East Timor was actually Ford, technically. Nixon's vice president, after the Watergate scandal happened. It was actually, organized in the end, supported by Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, who was an evil bastard. Dead now. Finally. That guy, cockroaches like that live way too long. I mean, this reminds me of how Rudolf Hess, the Nazi second in command to Hitler, lived to be 103. I think it was 103? Yeah, and then he killed himself. He was kept in prison that whole time. The U.S. repeatedly tried to release him and claimed he was harmless, which that Nazism and fascism were dead, which modern history has shown that's a load of crap, since fascism is now making a resurgence in Germany. The Soviets said that's bullshit. They refused to allow Hess to be released because he was imprisoned through a joint agreement at the end of World War II. After the Nuremberg trials and all that. Hess, so Hess was kept in prison until it's suggested that he was actually assassinated, maybe by a Soviet agent who infiltrated the prison or something. Because he was supposedly strangled himself with a garden hose, but he was a little old and frail to do that, so he may have actually been killed. Could have been someone from the West just as well. It was costing a lot of money to keep him in prison. I'm sure there were some people who just wanted to stop spending the money. And if they can make it look like the Soviets did it, so much the better. But one way or another, dead. He lived to an insane age, as did Henry Kissinger. It's funny how some of the most evil people on the planet live so long, and then good people die young sometimes. Sometimes because they get assassinated, like Martin Luther King Jr., unfortunately. MLK, by the way, socialist. He became a socialist in his last couple years of life. He was constantly harassed and spied on by the FBI, and it's been suggested that his assassination may have had something to do with the CIA. So, not necessarily that it was organized, but that the assassin may have, just like the one who killed JFK, that there may have been some like tangential ideas may have been planted in certain heads, kind of thing. Or am I mixing up with stuff about just JFK assassination? There was like the guy who was actually caught the JFK assassination, and the whole thing was pinned on, and I'm presuming he was really the guy who did it. Actually had a friend who was CIA, if I remember correctly, and it's been suggested that this guy played mind games with them, because it doesn't make sense that guy went on to kill JFK. That guy actually had tried to kill a fascist general, like an openly fascist general in the U.S. Army, a retired one. Or was it a Marine? No, I think it was Army. They tried to kill a retired general who was openly saying fascist things. He hated and feared the right wing, not the left. So it makes no sense that he would have gone after JFK unless the guy was unstable, unless his CIA friend maybe nudged him in that direction. Can't be proven, but it's been suggested. And we'll never know, honestly. There's no way to prove or disprove this theory, because it's not like the conversations they had are recorded. We just know that he knew a guy who was CIA. Doesn't mean that that guy was anything other than a friend, an acquaintance. But, people look for these insane conspiracy theories of there being a different assassin and overlook the really obvious things like his friend put him up to it because the guy was mentally unstable. And people like that, the CIA excels in manipulating people like that. Anyways, yeah, and the CIA wanted revenge against JFK because JFK refused to invade Cuba. In fact, the CIA had a plan, Operation Northwoods, to do false flag attacks, including terrorist bombings in Washington, D.C., killing American citizens, and then blame it on Cuba. Like, make it look like people they had killed had actually been killed by Cuba and use as a justification to invade the country. Because, the Bay of Pigs was a horrible fuck up. And they were just the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, and the CIA hadn't given up. They wanted to conquer Cuba and put another far-right government in there, just like the one that ruled Cuba before the Cuban Revolution. Batista was a far-right evil piece of shit. He was the dictator who ruled Cuba before the Cuban Revolution. He ruled the country in collaboration with organized crime, particularly like the U.S. Mafia, and brings up prostitution, gambling, casinos and stuff, human trafficking, drugs, extortion, murder. He was a evil person. So evil, in fact, that the U.S. House of Representatives actually voted to sanction the country, even though this guy was supposedly a U.S. ally, and to, once the revolution started there, to actually ban arms shipments to Cuba, which the president at the time, I forget who it was, actually ignored this and sent weapons to help Batista anyways. This is a long history of sometimes the U.S. legislature does the right thing and says, we're not going to send weapons to this dictator, and the president just does it anyways. That's Iran-Contra scandal. Reagan did it. That is Indonesia. I believe with Indonesian genocide, Nixon was actually told no, and he did it anyways. And that is Batista, the Cuban dictator. Of course, now this isn't talked about. Batista is put up on some pedestal, some saint, even though the vote in the House of Representatives to calling out his crimes against humanity and banning weapons sales to Cuba is quite clearly recorded in the the voting records of the U.S. House of Representatives. It's not even a question. This guy was a bad guy, and the speeches about it and stuff, they're there. They're in the history books. They're in the archives if you want to find it before Trump tries to purge it or something. I'd be surprised. History being rewritten is the hallmark of fascist regimes, and Trump is a fascist. And I am hoping, like hell, that I'll eventually be able to get out of the United States before people like that come for me for my political beliefs. Because it's getting bad. I mean, the whole ICE thing, that's only just the beginning. That's just testing the waters, and like mass deportations. That's testing the waters, seeing how much Trump is seeing how much he can get away with, and that's about exhausting the opposition. Because people get tired of protesting, and protest is not really effective. It doesn't change anything. People get tired of the protest, they get tired of that outcry, and then they just go back to their lives, and then Trump does another evil thing. If he can exhaust opposition on the ICE thing, then he can get away with even more fascist stuff later. It's a strategy, and it's a vile one, and it's what's happening. Which is why people need to do more effective stuff than just protest. I couldn't tell you what. I mean, but there's this guy, Ted Sturmer or something. He's a historian of resistance politics. He's been doing a YouTube channel talking about what resistance really means, and it's more than just protest. Protest alone will not stop a fascist regime. It's become clear Trump doesn't give a shit what the law is. You're not going to beat him by lawsuits or letter writing or protest. He's just going to ignore those things. Even when the court rules against him, he'll try and ignore what the courts rule half the time. The only thing that will work is resistance. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. Honestly, I have no experience with it. But there's got to be ways to obstruct him, to get in his way, to make it clear this is not going to stand. Because otherwise, we're going to end up either with a dystopian, tyrannical regime that no one stopped, or we're going to end up with a civil war if people take up arms because he wasn't stopped earlier. Either one is terrible, and that's what's going to happen if people don't find a way to stop Trump. So, because there are a lot of heavily armed nuts, and even some of the right-wingers at this point are deciding that they want to stop Trump, which was unexpected and might just be bullshit that the media is overplaying. It may not be, I haven't talked with these people, but even some of them seem, because we're talking more like the libertarian leaning, some of the more non-hypocritical libertarian types. Some of them are heavily armed, and yeah, that could be how it starts, but once violence happens, it can spin out of control. This is part of why I am, by the way, a democratic socialist, not a Marxist-Leninist, because Marxist-Leninists, well, they say they don't want civil wars, but then they talk about peaceful revolutions, and then they talk about how the ruling class will predictably violently crack down these peaceful revolutions, which is true. What do they think is going to happen then? Civil war. They know it, they just can't say it. And that's one thing. But the fact that they seem, many communists, many Marxist-Leninists seem to have this weird, almost fetishized appreciation of past civil wars, violent revolutions. I mean, I don't think they realize how terrible those things are. I don't really realize how traumatizing and destructive civil wars can be, and it's not the only way to get change, and indeed it's probably less likely to succeed than cannier, more clever methods. That being said, Democratic Socialists, not one of these DSA pricks who thinks, oh, we'll just work with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is a dead end. If you're an American, you're a leftist, you want change, you need to form third parties. You might vote with the Democrats in some cases until you can maybe secure a constitutional convention and actually get the two-party system fixed. That needs to be the number one priority for anyone who wants to change the country, is ending the two-party system that doesn't allow real political change. And that may only become possible because things get so bad in the country that people are willing to consider things they wouldn't have before. Maybe. And this is still going to be incredibly hard. People are just going to have to harp on it and harp on it and harp on it and keep that their number one goal. The number one goal has to be the end of the two-party system. Nothing else is possible in the long run until you end the two-party system. Protecting immigrants, important. Protecting trans people, important. All these things, they all matter. But none of them are as important as just ending the two-party system, because if you don't end the two-party system, you won't succeed in any of these other things. The two-party system ensures that real change is impossible. That's what people need to keep in mind. And it has to be ended. And that means the only way that can be achieved is through electoral reform, is through proportional representation, ranked choice voting systems, single transfer vote, that kind of thing. You cannot continue with the electoral system the way it's currently structured. It has to be reformed. Because if you do not change the electoral system, if you do not end the two-party duopoly, the country will self-destruct. And no change will happen until then. And then you'll just have to rebuild something that's not the two-party system from the ashes instead. I think even enough of the billionaire class realize this truth, that you might get some class traders in the billionaire class who are willing to work against their own class interests just to avoid, the violence, because some of them, they may not give a shit how poor people are poor, but they don't want violence, even if they may still come out ahead through it. Because, while war can be profitable, even a civil war, to the very, very rich. It may be possible by getting even some of the billionaires on board to end the two-party system, even though they benefit from it. It's leading to horrible things. May not be possible. I'm not saying that the strategy should be to get those people on board, but if they come on board with the idea, fine. Just try not to let them co-opt any movements, because ending the two-party system is only the first step. You're going to have to break the power of the billionaires after, but it cannot be ignored. It has to be the first step. It's not the only step. I don't think this is going to happen, though. It's what needs to happen. It's what people should put as their goal. I don't think people are going to rally around this. I don't think Americans are willing to educate themselves about politics, or willing to think outside the box, or willing to be honest with themselves about how bad things are going to get until it's too late. That's why I want out of the country. It's why, if a couple years from now in Norway or Sweden or Finland or Denmark or France or Germany, even with the fascists trying to take over there, any country, that's not desperately third world poverty says, okay, we'll take refugees from the United States, I'm then there. I'm out of here. Because I have no faith left that ordinary Americans they'll sit there and say, we need to protest. People realize things aren't right, but they won't take it far enough. It's never, we need to reform the Constitution. It's never, we need to do more than just protest. We need to hold strikes or whatever. It's, where people walk out on businesses, or we need to boycott even. That doesn't happen. It's, Americans are reacting too little, too slowly. I have zero faith, especially with the predominant neoliberalism in the United States, which is the ideology of both the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans have a more right-wing version of neoliberalism, and the Democrats are left, but it's an ideology of weak welfare systems, of deregulated business, of low taxes. It's the ideology of both parties. And so many Americans have drank the Kool-Aid on that, and too slow to walk away from it. You don't see an emerging Marxist movement. You don't even see the libertarians picking up that much political power. You don't see the Green Party pick up that much support. I don't think there's a prayer of the country saving itself. I've outlined what needs to be done. Constitutional Convention and the two-party system. Electoral reform. We could end the Electoral College while we're at it, but even if we don't, a ranked choice voting system for the presidency has to happen. I don't think people are going to do it. And I think it's going to get to the point where dissidents like myself are going to be rounded up and potentially shot or left to rot in prison. And I have long COVID. If I get locked away in prison for a decade for having political beliefs, if that's what happens, that the government doesn't like, I'll die. my body does not react to physical stress nearly as well as a normal person's body. Heck, I spend half the day lying down, exhausted, under pretty much optimal conditions, or, well, not optimal, but I have a roof over my head. I'm not subject to the brutality of the U.S. prison system. And, you know, able to do a reasonable job to try and nourish my body with decent foods. You put me in that situation, I'll have a heart attack at some point. No question. Or stroke. I will die if that happens. And that's if they don't just shoot me, if it doesn't go to death squads. So I have to get out. If there's a way to get out eventually, I can do it legally. Boom. Gone. I want out, but I can't get out. As a disabled person, I can't get a work visa in another country because I can't work enough to support myself. And I don't have family, so I can't do it outside of the country, so I can't do a family reunification visa. I keep trying to get relatives of mine to leave. I tell them, but none of them will listen. They're too comfortable in their lives, so it's not like one of them could leave and then I could family reunification because no one I'm related to is taking this seriously enough. I mean, well, my brother. But he's too depressed to actually do anything. Yeah. So he's the only one who has any semblance of an understanding of how bad things might get, and he suffers from depression periodically. So he's not gonna leave. I don't have a prayer for leaving, and that's more family reunification. Usually like you have a parent or like a wife or a husband who's outside the country, or a child. It's not actually even a sibling. I'm screwed. I'm screwed unless the country says they'll take political refugees in the United States, which can include people who are not yet being persecuted, but have reason to legitimately fear future persecution, which is absolutely me. I mean, it could turn out that I'm wrong, but I have good reason to suspect it. You know, there's a very good chance, it could not happen anyways, but there's a very good chance, nothing is ever assured, that the country will go fascist and I'll be murdered for my political beliefs, essentially. Might not even take the government doing it. It could just be that it gets to where, you know, your run-of-the-mill ordinary neo-Nazis just go out and do like hate crimes against people they don't like. And, you know, like, the police don't get in the way, don't stop them. Turn a blind eye. That could happen too. Alright, well, it's enough of this. The thing is a slightly more positive note. Whatever happens, everything that's happening now will be history. Everything will be recorded, and people will learn from the past, hopefully, this time around. Never guaranteed, but not every country in the world is as blind as the United States is to the past. People in America think that history doesn't matter, but in the rest of the world, that's not so much the perspective. I mean, history is often propagandized to support the current regime in any country in the world and to support nationalist movements, but it's not completely effective. And there's definitely a tendency that everything that goes wrong provides an example to the rest of the world of what not to do. So whatever else happens, people will learn from this. So there's a silver lining. And some people will survive this, maybe even me if I'm lucky. So there are people with memories of what went wrong, in addition to, you know, stuff in the history books, that people eventually, you know, die of old age or whatever, that memory fades. The past gets propagandized. You only have to look at how, like, anyone who says that it was terrible to live under the Soviet Union, and there were huge problems because they were a one-party state. That's one of the problems I have with Lenin's theories. It leads to one-party state. That's not inherent to socialism. You need opposition parties. Democratic Socialists will always hold to that. You can abolish capitalism and still have multiple competing political parties. It's Lenin's idea that all the socialist parties need to merge into a single political party. That's what leads to the authoritarian rule the Soviet Union had. That said, they still achieved the world's second highest level of income equality, behind Sweden at the time, actually. And one of the fastest long-term GDP growth rates the world had ever seen. It was well ahead of the United States, and it was usually about number 2 or 3 in the world rankings. So it was never number 1 in any of these things, neither income equality nor long-term GDP growth rate, until there was an inflection point within the Bretton Woods system. They were number 2 behind France, I think, until then, and then France stagnated after the end of Bretton Woods. Its economy just stopped growing. And Japan ended up being the front runner, number 1 in long-term GDP growth rate. By the way, it's stagnated in the modern era too. It had like 30 years of really strong growth, and then it stagnated, or 20 years or something. Soviet Union, I don't know if it dropped to number 3 after Bretton Woods or stayed in the number 2 slot, but it was one of the fastest growing economies in the long-term growth rate. Because it was socialist and not capitalist, it didn't have the boom-bust cycle, so it's not like its economy shot 12% one year and then shrank 6% the next. Instead, it would grow slow and well, not slow, but it grows steadily at 6% a year, which is actually a higher growth rate than, that's why I say long-term growth rate. And because the income equality was so high, it's not like in a lot of the Western countries where even as the economy is growing, income equality is getting worse. So ordinary people can actually see their standard of living decline even as the economy grows. That didn't happen in the Soviet Union. In fact, because economically things were good for a lot of people, this may have been what led people to become complacent and to see there were still huge problems in their lives, because a one-party state has a lot of corruption, has a lot of problems, and to blame socialism instead of blaming the lack of opposition parties. And ultimately, the Soviet Union failed because people did not believe in the system and did not try and reform the system, mostly. And you had Gorbachev, who was blind to some of the people he did put in power to try and reform the system because he thought it could be reformed. That a lot of these people wanted to destroy the system. They had no faith in it. Some of them have written memos, books, and such about how they were secretly trying to destroy the Soviet Union from within. I'm surprised that the KGB or whatever didn't go and hunt them down after, in Putin's era. Some of these people are very old now, but, the Russians are pretty ruthless historically. You'd think that they would want revenge, but no, they haven't done it for the most part. I guess because there's so many people like this. And they got into positions in power, particularly the guy Gorbachev put him in charge of media reform in the Soviet Union, which led to an explosion of anti-socialist media. When Glasnost opening up led to an end to a lot of the censorship. But then you had this media guy who was actually encouraging the media to criticize socialism and to take pro-capitalist standpoints instead of pro-nationalist standpoints, and feeding these far-right organizations and such to destabilize the system, instead of just trying to create a system that was fair where anyone could have a voice, or anyone but fascists. This guy, I don't think he admitted to this in his memo, but he was probably working with the CIA as well, but he has openly admitted he tried to tear down the system from within. And he was very high up in Gorbachev's, he was in his cabinet, basically, the equivalent of I don't know, the Secretary of Education or something in the United States, that kind of rank. When people who want to destroy a system, they get that high up, and the ordinary people stop believing in the system, that system is doomed to fail. It doesn't matter how well the economy is doing. And the lack of opposition parties actually made the Soviet Union more vulnerable to collapse, because again, you need opposition parties for a stable system. Anyways, I wish you all the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. And may you always find a guiding story with you. Until next time, it's Northstar. Adieu, and best luck.